There is a silence in war that is far louder than the roar of any cannon, a stillness so profound it seems to stop the very rotation of the earth. On the morning of October the 25th, 1854, 673 men sat atop their horses in a valley in the Crimea, holding their breath in just such a silence, staring down a mile-long corridor that any sane military tactician would recognize immediately as a death trap. If you believe that such moments of supreme courage and tragic folly deserve to be preserved against the eroding sands of time, I invite you to subscribe to our channel that we might keep the memory of these men alive together. To the observer on the heights, and indeed there were many spectators that day, watching the war as if it were a theatrical performance, the Light Brigade must have looked like toy soldiers arranged upon a verdant carpet. The lines were impossibly straight, the uniforms immaculate despite the privations of the campaign. But if one were to look closer, zooming in past the spectacle of the mass, one would find the terrifying reality of the individual. Amongst the dragoons and the hussars sat the 17th Lancers, perhaps the most distinctive regiment in the British Army. They were known by their grim and singular motto, death or glory, and upon the front of their plastrons and on their caps they wore a badge that chilled the blood of those who saw it for the first time, a silver skull and crossbones. It was an emblem chosen decades prior to remind them of the mortality of General Wolfe, but on this cold October morning, it seemed less like a memorial and more like a premonition. The men of the 17th sat motionless, the steam rising from the flanks of their chargers, their lances held upright, the pennants fluttering lazily in the damp breeze. They were the Duke's darlings, the elite, the peacocks of the cavalry. Yet beneath the gold braid and the tight-fitting jackets beat the hearts of terrified young men, grooms, farmhands, and the sons of the gentry who could see, with perfect clarity, what lay at the end of that valley. At the far end, over a mile away, sat the Russian artillery. Dark, brooding iron mouths pointed directly at the British chest. But it was not merely the guns in front that posed the threat. To the left, on the Feud hills, were more Russian batteries and riflemen. To the right, on the Causeway Heights, which had been lost earlier that morning, were yet more cannon. It was a three-sided box of fire, a kill zone. To walk into it was dangerous. To ride a horse into it was madness. To charge a cavalry brigade through it was murder. And yet, the men of the 17th Lancers did not turn their horses. They checked their girths. They soothed their mounting panic with the rigid, comforting discipline of the drill. They trusted their officers, and their officers trusted the general, and the general trusted the commander-in-chief. It was a chain of command forged in the fires of the Napoleonic Wars, a system built on the absolute assumption that a British gentleman would not throw away the lives of his men without purpose. Little did they know that the chain had already broken. Up on the ridge, high above the valley floor, a conversation was taking place that would doom them all. It was a brief exchange, fueled by vague handwriting, personal animosity, and the arrogance of aristocrats who viewed war as a sport. A pencil-scrawled note was handed from a one-armed veteran of Waterloo to a hot-headed aide-de-camp. It was a piece of paper that should have saved the day. Instead, it would become the death warrant for the Light Brigade. Down in the valley, the 17th could not hear the arguments on the heights. They could only hear the restless stamping of hooves and the distant, mocking jeers of the Russian Cossacks. The waiting is always the worst part for a soldier. The imagination is a far more cruel torturer than the enemy. Each man had time to think of home, of the green fields of Leicestershire, or the smoggy streets of London, and to weigh the silence against the violence that was to come. They gripped their lances, 16 feet of ash wood tipped with steel, weapons that belonged to a bygone age of chivalry, now poised to face the industrial slaughter of rifled artillery. One can only imagine the thoughts of the regimental sergeant major as he looked down the line, checking the dressing of the ranks one last time. He would have seen faces hardened by the cholera and the freezing nights, faces that looked to him for reassurance. He offered none, save for the stern projection of duty. They were the 17th. They did not question. They did not flinch. If the order came to ride off a cliff, they would maintain formation until they hit the rocks below. Then the movement caught their eye. A lone figure, Captain Nolan, riding furiously down the precipitous slope from the command post, his horse kicking up clods of earth as he scrambled toward the valley floor. He bore the paper. He bore the command. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The idle tension vanished, replaced by a rigid electric focus. Every trooper tightened his grip on the reins. The horses, sensing the shift in their rider's pulse, pricked their ears. The officers drew their sabers, the steel hissing against the scabbards, a sound that carried sharply in the cold air. Lord Lucan, the cavalry commander, read the note. He looked at the messenger. He looked down the valley at the Russian army entrenched in position. He pointed out the impossibility of the task. But the messenger, flushed with insolence and urgency, swept his arm across the horizon, a vague, sweeping gesture that encompassed the world and demanded the advance. Lucan, trapped by the rigid code of obedience and his own simmering resentment, turned his horse to face the Light Brigade. He rode over to Lord Cardigan, the man who would lead the charge, a man he despised with a poisonous intensity. They exchanged brief, cold words. There was no shaking of hands, no brotherly embrace in the face of death. Just the icy formalities of men who would rather die than show fear to a rival. Cardigan took his place at the front, alone. He wore the uniform of the 11th Hussars, his own regiment, resplendent in cherry color and gold. He sat stiffly, a figure of absolute, almost comical arrogance, yet possessed of a physical courage that was undeniable. He raised his sword, the signal. The brigade will advance. The voice was calm, almost conversational. It was not a shout. It did not need to be. The order rippled down the line. Walk, march. The 17th Lancers on the left flank of the front line nudged their horses forward. The line moved as one single organism. There was no galloping, no cheering, no wild theatrics. They moved at a walk, a stately, deliberate parade ground pace. The silence of the wait was broken now by the rhythmic thudding of 2,400 hooves hitting the turf, the jingle of the bit chains, and the creak of leather. The Russians at the end of the valley watched in disbelief. They saw the thin lines of red and blue detach themselves from the safety of the British position and begin to navigate the corridor. The Russian gunners, standing by their cannons with lit matches, must have exchanged glances of confusion. Surely, they thought, this is a feint. Surely they will turn back. No general would send light cavalry into the mouth of a volcano. But the line did not turn. It kept coming. The walk turned into a trot. The distance closed. The 17th Lancers fixed their eyes on the smoke on the horizon, the skull and crossbones on their chests rising and falling with the rhythm of the ride. They were riding out of the world of the living and into the pages of legend, and then the first Russian gun fired. To understand why 600 men were ordered to ride into the mouth of a cannonade, we must first withdraw our gaze from the smoke-choked valley of Balaclava. We must pull back across the Black Sea, across the turbulent map of 19th century Europe, to the hushed corridors of diplomacy where the fate of empires is decided not with blood, but with ink. The tragedy of the 17th Lancers did not begin with a mistaken order in 1854. It began years earlier in the collision of two colossal tectonic plates, the dying light of the Ottoman Empire and the rising shadow of Imperial Russia. At the heart of this collision lay what the statesmen of the day called the Eastern Question, a polite euphemism for a predatory reality. The Ottoman Empire, once the scourge of Christendom, was crumbling. It was the sick man of Europe, a sprawling, antiquated giant whose grip on its territories was loosening with every passing year. And watching this slow decay with a hungry, predatory patience was the Russian bear. Tsar Nicholas I, an autocrat of the old school who believed his authority flowed directly from the Almighty, saw the collapse of the Turks not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. He cast his covetous eyes toward Constantinople, the Bosphorus, and the warm waters of the Mediterranean. For Britain, sitting secure on her island throne, the industrial workshop of the world, this was an intolerable prospect. It was not a matter of sentiment, but of cold, hard strategy. If the Russians were to seize the Dardanelles, their fleets could sever the vital arteries of British trade. Even more terrifying was the threat to the east. To the British mind, every Russian advance into Central Asia was a dagger pointed at the throat of India. The preservation of the Ottoman Empire, therefore, became a strange but necessary obsession for the gentlemen in Whitehall. They would prop up the sick man not out of love for the Turk, but out of fear of the Tsar. Thus, when war was finally declared in March of 1854, it was greeted in London not with dread, but with a peculiar, almost festive enthusiasm. It had been nearly 40 years since the Battle of Waterloo. 40 years since the Iron Duke Wellington had crushed Napoleon and secured a peace that felt as if it would last forever. But peace, for a martial nation, can be a dangerous sedative. A generation of Brightons had grown up knowing war only through the romanticized paintings of heavy dragoons and the stirring verses of victory. They had forgotten the mud, the dysentery, and the horror. They saw only the glory. The British army that sailed for the East was, in many respects, a magnificent museum piece. It was an army frozen in the amber of 1815. The ghost of Wellington still ruled every mess hall and every parade ground. The logic was simple, if fatally flawed. If it was good enough for the Duke, it is good enough for us. Officers purchased their commissions for thousands of pounds, treating the command of a regiment as a social investment rather than a professional burden. They were brave men, undeniably aristocrats who would stand unflinching in the face of fire, but they were amateurs fighting a professional's war. At the head of this expeditionary force stood Lord Raglan. He was a man of 65, a kind, courteous gentleman who had served as Wellington's military secretary for decades. He had left his right arm on the field of Waterloo, a sacrifice to his country. Yet he had never commanded an army in the field. He was an administrator, a diplomat, a relic of a bygone era. Indeed, so entrenched was he in the past that throughout the Crimean campaign he would frequently confuse his Russian enemy with his French allies, habitually referring to the foe as the French, much to the embarrassment of his staff. This was the army that the 17th Lancers belonged to, a force of dazzling aesthetic perfection and terrifying incompetence. The soldiers were dressed in uniforms designed for the parade grounds of St. James's Park, not the freezing steppes of Russia. They wore tight collars that restricted breathing, heavy bearskins that soaked up the rain, and jackets that offered no warmth against the biting wind. The commissariat, the department responsible for supplies, was a bureaucratic labyrinth that would soon prove more lethal than any Russian bayonet. Yet, as the troopships departed Portsmouth and Southampton, cheered on by weeping crowds and waving handkerchiefs, there was no thought of winter. The bands played "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and the mood was one of a grand, violent holiday. Many officers brought their wives, some even brought their own wine cellars and hunting dogs, expecting a swift campaign, a few sharp battles to teach the Tsar a lesson, and a triumphant return by Christmas. Little did they know that they were sailing toward a logistical apocalypse. The reality of the war struck them long before they saw a Russian soldier. The army landed first at Varna, in modern-day Bulgaria, a staging post that became a graveyard. Here, under the sweltering summer sun, a silent enemy infiltrated the camp. It was not the Cossack, but the Vibrio cholerae. Cholera tore through the regiments with indiscriminate malice. Men who had spent years perfecting the gleam of their boots and the curl of their mustaches were reduced to wretches, dying in their own filth in overcrowded hospital tents. The 17th Lancers watched their comrades waste away, burying them in shallow graves, the death or glory motto taking on a grim, unglamorous irony. By the time the decision was made to invade the Crimea itself to strike at the great Russian naval fortress of Sebastopol, the army was already weakened, shaken, and reduced in number. But the invasion went ahead. On September the 14th, the Grand Armada arrived at Calamita Bay. It was a spectacle of imperial might. Hundreds of ships filling the horizon, the steam funnels belching black smoke, the white sails of the line of battleships gleaming. But as the troops disembarked, the farce of British organization revealed itself. They landed on a desolate beach with no tents, no transport, and precious little water. That first night, the rains came. The finest army in the world, the victors of Waterloo, slept in the mud, soaked to the bone, shivering under a deluge that turned the beach into a quagmire. Lord Raglan slept in a small farmhouse. His men slept in puddles. It was a foretaste of the winter to come, a warning that nature would be a far more formidable opponent than the Tsar's legions. And yet, despite the cholera, despite the rain, despite the criminally negligent lack of ambulances and wagons, the spirit of the men remained unbroken. They were British soldiers, after all. They possessed a stoic, stubborn pride that defied logic. They marched south toward Sebastopol, their uniforms stained, their faces gaunt, but their discipline intact. They met the Russians first at the River Alma. It was a chaotic, bloody affair, a battle won not by the genius of the generals who largely lost control of the fight, but by the sheer, bull-headed courage of the infantry who walked uphill into a storm of lead. The 17th Lancers watched from the flanks, frustrated spectators as the infantry covered themselves in glory. The cavalry was kept on a tight leash, Lord Lucan forbidden from pursuing the retreating Russians. It was a decision that rankled. The death or glory boys were eager to prove their worth, to wash away the stain of inaction. After the Alma, the British and French armies commenced the siege of Sebastopol. They marched around the city to the port of Balaclava, a small, deep-water harbor that would become their lifeline to England. It was here, on the upland overlooking the port, that the camp was established. It was here that the stage was set. By late October, the weather was turning. The nights were growing colder, the wind sharper. The Russian field army hovering in the interior was gathering strength, probing for weaknesses in the British lines. They saw the vulnerability of Balaclava, the supply base that fed the siege. If they could cut the road to the port, the British army on the heights would starve. The 17th Lancers were camped in the valley near the village of Kotokoi. They were bored, restless, and dangerously eager for a fight. They spent their days grooming their horses, those that hadn't died of sickness, and sharpening their sabers. They were commanded by officers who felt the weight of the long peace, men desperate for laurels of their own to rival the stories of their fathers. As the sun set on the 24th of October, a strange quiet settled over the camps. The pickets reported movement in the Russian lines, the rumble of wheels, the murmur of thousands of men. The bear was waking up. He was preparing to swipe at the supply lines of the invader. In the tents of the 17th, the men cleaned their kit by the light of flickering tallow candles. They did not know that the next day would bring the opportunity they had craved since leaving England. They did not know that the sun would rise on a day of such catastrophe that it would be debated for centuries. They simply knew that the enemy was close, and that the skull and crossbones on their caps demanded a payment in blood. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on the most tragic act of the war. To understand the tragedy of Balaclava, one must understand that the 17th Lancers were never designed for the squalid realities of modern attrition. They were a weapon forged for a different age, a gleaming artifact of a time when war was still considered the highest calling of a gentleman. They were not merely a regiment, they were a cult of martial elegance, bound together by a badge that remains the most chilling in the history of the British Army. While other regiments wore the crests of royalty, lions, crowns, and harps, the 17th wore the face of death itself. A silver skull, devoid of the lower jaw, crossed by two femur bones resting above a banner that read simply, or glory. It is a common misconception that this was a symbol of piracy or lawless aggression. It was in fact quite the opposite. It was a mournful tribute, a memento mori cast in silver. The regiment was raised in 1759 by Colonel John Hale, a man who had stood on the plains of Abraham in Quebec and watched General James Wolfe die in the moment of his greatest victory. Hale returned to England haunted by that sacrifice, determined to raise a regiment that would honor the precarious nature of a soldier's life. He chose the death's head not to frighten the enemy, but to remind his own men that their contract was with the grave. From their very inception, the 17th were told that they were already dead men walking. The only variable left to them was how they would meet their end. This morbid heraldry, however, concealed a regiment of distinctive swagger. By the mid-19th century, the 17th Lancers were known throughout the Empire as Bingham's Dandies, named after their colonel, Lord Bingham. They were the peacocks of the cavalry. To be an officer in the 17th required a private income that would bankrupt a small nation. Their mess bills were astronomical, their uniforms tailored within an inch of their lives. It was said that a 17th Lancer's jacket was so tight that he required the assistance of two batmen to put it on, and once inside he could barely breathe, let alone bleed. They were the darlings of the London social season, the envy of every ballroom from Mayfair to Manchester, their blue tunics with white plastrons, the square-topped chapka hats fluttering with plumes. It was a uniform designed to break hearts, but it would be a grave mistake to dismiss them as mere toy soldiers. Beneath the gold braid and the cologne lay a terrifying professionalism. The weapon that defined them, the lance, was a cruel and unforgiving mistress. It was not a simple sword that one could hack and slash with in a brute rage. It was 9 feet of ash wood, weighted and balanced, tipped with a triangular steel point. To master it required years of relentless drill. A lancer had to guide his horse with his knees alone, leaving his hands free to manipulate the weapon. He had to learn to parry a saber cut with the wooden shaft, to thrust with the speed of a viper, and to recover the lance instantly before the weight of a falling body tore it from his grasp. In the riding schools of England, the death or glory boys practiced until their hands were calloused and their thighs were like iron. They rode without stirrups, crossing their arms over their chests, learning to move in perfect rhythm with the beast beneath them. This bond between man and horse is the sacred unspoken pact of the cavalry. A trooper in the 17th spent more time grooming his charger than he did washing himself. He knew the animal's temperament, its fears, the specific way its ears twitched before it shied. In the Crimea, when the fodder ran out and the horses began to eat their own tails from hunger, grown men would be seen weeping as they watched their silent partners waste away. Leading this brotherhood into the fire were officers who were a strange mix of the sublime and the ridiculous. There was, of course, the overarching shadow of the aristocracy, but the man who would actually lead the regiment on the day of the charge was Captain William Morris. Morris was an anomaly in the Light Brigade. He was short, stout, and lacked the willowy grace of his peers. But unlike the lords who commanded him, Morris was a killer. He had served in India during the Sikh Wars. At the Battle of Aliwal, he had ridden into the teeming masses of the Sikh infantry. He knew what it felt like to drive a saber through a man's ribs. He knew the sickening sound of a horse screaming in agony. While his superiors debated the width of a stripe on a trouser leg, Morris studied the geometry of slaughter. He was a professional soldier in a sea of amateurs, a man who understood that the skull on his cap was not a fashion statement. Supporting him were young men like Cornet Cleveland and Lieutenant Mully Newboys, really fresh from the playing fields of Eton and Harrow. They had purchased their commissions for thousands of pounds, viewing the war as a grand extension of a fox hunt. They wrote cheerful letters home to their mothers, complaining about the lack of decent champagne and the dirtiness of the locals, utterly oblivious to the fact that they were standing on the precipice of annihilation. And then there were the troopers themselves. The butchers, the bakers, the farmhands who had taken the Queen's shilling to escape the drudgery of the plough or the factory. They were hard men, rough men, disciplined by the lash and the rigid hierarchy of the Victorian army. Yet they possessed a fierce, tribal loyalty to the regiment. They were 17th Lancers. They looked down on the hussars. They pitied the infantry. They believed with a religious fervor that they were the finest horsemen on earth. As they sat in the mud of the Crimea, polishing their bits and whitening their belts with pipe clay, a transformation occurred. The dandyism fell away, leaving only the steel. The 17th had a reputation to uphold. They had served in the American Revolutionary War, chasing down rebels in the Carolinas. They had served in India. They carried the history of the regiment not in books, but in their posture. The thought of turning back, of failing to charge, was a shame more potent than the fear of death. In the days leading up to Balaclava, Captain Morris drilled them relentlessly. He saw the incompetence of the high command he had argued with Lord Lucan, a dangerous move for a mere captain, and he feared the worst. He knew that if the order came, it would likely be a foolish one, and he knew that his men would have to execute it with such perfection that it would transcend the folly of the order itself. So they waited, the skull and crossbones gleaming in the pale autumn sun. They were a magnificent anachronism, a regiment of lancers in an age of rifled muskets, a beautiful, fragile glass hammer about to be swung against a wall of granite. They were the death or glory boys, and as the morning of October the 25th dawned, the glory seemed very far away, while death was saddling his horse and preparing to ride alongside them. It is a comfortable fiction of military history to believe that battles are lost solely due to the cunning of the enemy or the cruelty of the terrain. We prefer to think of defeat as a matter of superior numbers or inferior weaponry, for these are tangible, measurable things. But the catastrophe of Balaclava was not forged in the foundries of Russia, nor was it dictated by the landscape of the Crimea. It was manufactured in the drawing rooms of London, born of a toxic alchemy of arrogance, nepotism, and a personal hatred so venomous that it broke the very chain of command upon which an army depends. To understand the fate of the 17th Lancers, one must look away from the troopers polishing their saddles in the mud and gaze instead at the three men who held their lives in their manicured hands: Lord Raglan, the Earl of Lucan, and the Earl of Cardigan. Three peers of the realm, three pillars of the British aristocracy, and three men who between them possessed a terrifying incapacity for modern warfare. At the apex of this pyramid stood Lord Raglan. Fitzroy Somerset, the first Baron Raglan, was a man carved from the marble of a bygone age. He was 66 years old, a courtly, soft-spoken gentleman who had spent the last 40 years behind a desk at the Horse Guards. His defining moment had come at Waterloo, where, as the Duke of Wellington's military secretary, he had shattered his arm. He had endured the amputation without a murmur, famously calling out to the surgeon to bring back the severed limb so he could retrieve a ring from the finger. He was brave, undeniably. He was kind, unfailingly, but he was a ghost. Raglan commanded the army in the Crimea as if the Iron Duke were still whispering in his ear. He viewed the war through the sepia-tinted lens of 1815. He was so entrenched in the past that he could not bring himself to name the enemy correctly. Time and again, pointing at the gray-coated columns of the Russians, he would confusingly refer to them as the French, unable to shake the habit of a lifetime, much to the bewilderment of his actual French allies. He commanded from a position of detached, Olympian distance, issuing orders that were polite suggestions rather than iron directives. He assumed his subordinates were gentlemen who would intuitively understand his intent. He did not realize that the men below him were not gentlemen in the same mold. They were rivals locked in a death spiral. Beneath Raglan, commanding the cavalry division, was George Bingham, the Earl of Lucan. If Raglan was the ghostly grandfather, Lucan was the harsh, unloved father. He was a man of fierce intelligence and tireless industry, known to his troops as the Look-On for his habit of micromanaging every detail of camp life. He was a martinet, a man who would punish a soldier for a dirty button while the army starved for lack of bread. Lucan was capable in a rigid mathematical sense, but he lacked the spark of imagination. He treated war as a ledger to be balanced. He had spent years away from active service, managing his vast estates in Ireland with a ruthlessness that had earned him the hatred of his tenants during the famine. He brought that same cold, landlord's eye to the cavalry. But Lucan's greatest liability was not his rigid mind, it was his brother-in-law. Commanding the Light Brigade, the very spear-tip of Lucan's force, was James Brudenell, the Earl of Cardigan. To describe Cardigan is to describe a caricature of the Victorian aristocrat brought to improbable life. He was fabulously wealthy, breathtakingly arrogant, and by most accounts possessing the intellect of a wooden rocking horse. He was the man who had spent £10,000 a year of his own money to outfit his regiment, the 11th Hussars, in the tightest, most expensive uniforms in Europe. He treated the Light Brigade as his personal toy set. While his men slept in the mud and died of cholera, Cardigan dined on French cuisine and slept every night aboard his private luxury yacht, the Dryad, anchored safely in Balaclava harbor. He would ride up to the front late in the morning, smelling of cologne and claret, to inspect men who were rotting alive in their rags. The tragedy lay in the relationship between these two men. Lucan and Cardigan were brothers-in-law, yet they detested one another with a passion that bordered on the operatic. They had spent decades bickering over family trusts, social slights, and professional jealousies. They did not speak to one another unless absolutely necessary, and even then their communication was laced with bile. In any rational military system, putting two men who hate each other in a direct chain of command would be grounds for a court-martial. But the British Army of 1844 was not a rational system, it was a social club. Both men had purchased their commissions. They owned their rank, just as they owned their horses and their country houses. Raglan, with his gentlemanly aversion to conflict, refused to intervene. He tried to manage them with polite tact, ignoring the fact that the friction between his two cavalry commanders was generating enough heat to burn the army down. The result was a paralysis of leadership. Lucan, the cautious micromanager, was terrified of making a mistake that would give Cardigan leverage over him. Cardigan, the reckless cavalier, resented every order Lucan gave, viewing his superior officer as a nagging obstruction to his own glory. They communicated through gritted teeth and surly aides to camp, interpreting every instruction in the worst possible light. As the army camped before Sevastopol, this feud festered like a gangrenous wound. When the cavalry failed to pursue the Russians after the Battle of the Alma, Cardigan loudly blamed Lucan's caution. When the heavy brigade charged brilliantly earlier on the morning of Balaclava, Cardigan sat idly by with his light brigade, refusing to support them because Lucan had told him to defend his position. He watched his comrades fighting for their lives and did nothing, later claiming with petulant accuracy that he was merely following orders. This was the state of the British High Command on that fateful morning. A commander-in-chief who issued vague, polite orders from a hilltop, disconnected from the reality of the valley floor. A cavalry commander who was so obsessed with obeying the letter of the law that he forgot the spirit of war, and a brigadier who was practically vibrating with a desire to prove his bravery, fueled by a deep-seated need to outshine his hated brother-in-law. The soldiers of the 17th Lancers knew nothing of the specific arguments raging in the officers' mess. They only knew that things were not right. They saw the confusion. They felt the hesitation. A regiment takes its mood from its commanders, and the mood of the British cavalry was one of frustrated anxiety. They were lions led by donkeys. But even donkeys can be dangerous when they are stubborn and frightened. As the sun climbed higher over the causeway heights, the stage was set for the ultimate failure of this broken system. The Russians were dragging away British naval guns from the captured redoubts, a direct insult to the honor of the Duke of Wellington's army. Lord Raglan, peering through his telescope high on the Saponi Ridge, saw this and felt a pang of desperation. He could not allow the enemy to steal the guns. He turned to his quartermaster general, General Airy, and dictated a new order. It was the fourth order of the day. It was meant to be a simple instruction to advance and recover the guns, but in the hands of these feuding aristocrats, words were slippery things. The order was scribbled down on a flimsy sheet of paper by a man resting it on his sabretache. It was handed to a messenger, and so the incompetence of the three lords was about to be sealed by the zeal of a captain. The powder keg had been packed by Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan over years of neglect and hatred. All it needed now was a spark. Little did they know, the spark was already galloping down the hill. The dawn of the 25th of October broke with a deceptive serenity. A pale, watery light spilled over the Crimean peninsula. illuminating a landscape that seemed almost theatrically designed for the drama that was to unfold. To the military eye, the terrain south of Sebastopol formed a natural amphitheater. There were two long, parallel valleys, the north and the south, divided by a spine of rolling hills known as the Causeway Heights. It was upon this central spine that the first act of the tragedy was played out, a prelude that would lull the British command into a fatal state of confidence. The silence was shattered not by the bugle, but by the roar of Russian artillery. General Liprandi, a capable and aggressive Russian commander, had launched a surprise assault on the Turkish redoubts that guarded the Causeway Heights. The Turkish troops, isolated and outgunned, fought bravely for a time, but under the relentless pounding of the Russian hammer, they broke from their positions in the valley below. The men of the 17th Lancers watched in grim silence as their allies streamed down the hills in retreat, leaving behind the very guns they were sworn to protect. To the British soldier, bred on the stubborn pride of the square, this retreat was a shameful spectacle. But the collapse of the Turks was merely the opening gambit. The Russians, emboldened by this easy victory, poured their cavalry into the South Valley, a grey tide of thousands threatening to wash over the British base at Balaclava. Standing between this tide and the defenseless port was a single regiment of infantry, the 93rd Highlanders, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. It was here that the first miracle of the day occurred. As the Russian cavalry thundered toward them, Campbell did not form a square, the standard defensive formation. Instead, he deployed his men in a line only 2 deep. He rode along the front, his voice cutting through the din. "There is no retreat here, men. You must die where you stand." The Highlanders did not flinch. They unleashed a rolling volley of rifle fire that shattered the Russian advance. From the heights, the war correspondent William Howard Russell watched in awe, scribbling down a phrase that would enter the lexicon of history, a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. The Russian cavalry, baffled by this wall of defiance, turned and fled. But the day's surprises were not over. The main body of the Russian horse, some 2,000 strong, crested the ridge and found themselves face to face with the British Heavy Brigade. These were the big men on big horses, the Scots Greys and the Inniskillings, commanded by General James Scarlett. They were outnumbered 3-1. They were fighting uphill. By all the laws of military science, they should have been annihilated. Instead, they charged. The 17th Lancers, sitting idle in the North Valley, had the best seats in the house for this magnificent display. They watched as the Heavy Brigade crashed into the Russian mass, like a red brick thrown into a wall of grey clay. For 8 glorious, chaotic minutes, the Heavies hacked and slashed their way through the enemy. It was a victory of sheer brute force and morale. The Russian cavalry, shaken by the ferocity of the assault, broke and galloped away in disgrace. A roar of triumph went up from the British lines. "Well done, the Heavies," cried the spectators on the ridge. Down in the valley, however, the mood among the 17th Lancers was not just one of jubilation, but of bitter jealousy. They had sat still while the Highlanders won glory. They had sat still while the Heavy Brigade won glory. Their horses were fresh, their lances were sharp, their blood was up. "Damned Heavies have the laugh of us this day," muttered a trooper in the ranks. Lord Cardigan, sitting stiffly before his regiment, was apoplectic. He had requested permission to support the Heavy Brigade, to chase the fleeing Russians and turn the defeat into a rout. But Lord Lucan, adhering rigidly to his orders to defend the position, had refused. The Light Brigade had stood like statues while their comrades fought. The 17th Lancers were a coiled spring wound tighter and tighter by the frustration of inactivity. This, then, was the psychological landscape at the critical hour of 11 o'clock. The British were winning. The Russians had been checked at every turn. Their cavalry was demoralized, their infantry hesitant. On the high ground of the Sapoon Ridge, Lord Raglan lowered his telescope with a sense of satisfaction. In his mind, the day was won. All that remained was to tidy up the battlefield. But then, through the shifting smoke, Raglan saw something that pricked the bubble of his contentment. On the Causeway Heights, the Russians were bringing forward teams of horses. They were preparing to tow away the British naval guns captured from the Turkish redoubts earlier that morning. To a modern mind, the loss of a few iron guns might seem a triviality in the grand scale of war. But to the Duke of Wellington's former secretary, it was a stain on the honor of the army. In the etiquette of 19th century warfare, losing guns to the enemy was tantamount to losing one's regimental colors. It was a humiliation that could not be borne. Raglan's blood, usually so cool, began to heat. He could not let the French, as he likely called the Russians in his mind, take those trophies. He turned to his quartermaster general, Richard Airy. "Airy," he said, pointing toward the heights, "we must stop them. The cavalry must advance and recover the guns." Airy, using the saddle of his aide as a desk, scribbled down the order in pencil. It was the fourth order of the day. It was brief, hasty, and lacking in the precise coordinates that a confused battlefield demands. It read, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. Immediate. Immediate, that was the word that sealed it. Raglan looked around for a messenger. His eyes landed on Captain Nolan. Nolan was a man who seemed to have stepped out of a different story. He was the aide-de-camp to General Airy, but he was also the army's premier expert on cavalry tactics. He had written books on the subject. He believed, with the fanaticism of a zealot, that light cavalry was the ultimate weapon of war, capable of sweeping aside any obstacle if led with sufficient dash. He despised the caution of Lord Lucan and the arrogance of Lord Cardigan. He made no secret of his contempt for these old women who commanded the cavalry. When Raglan handed him the note, he gave Nolan a specific verbal instruction. Tell Lord Lucan the cavalry is to attack immediately. Nolan took the scrap of paper. He was a man vibrating with suppressed energy, a coiled viper. He saluted, turned his horse, and dug his spurs into its flanks. He did not trot, he galloped. He rode down the steep, precipitous escarpment that separated the high command from the valley floor. It was a ride of pure, reckless theater. The men of the 17th Lancers, watching from the valley floor, saw a lone figure descending the heights like a thunderbolt. They did not know who he was or what news he carried. They only saw the speed of his approach, the urgency in every stride of his charger. Little did they know that Captain Nolan was not just carrying a piece of paper, he was carrying a match, and he was riding straight toward a powder keg of confused geography and bruised egos. As he hit the valley floor and thundered toward Lord Lucan, the fate of the Light Brigade was sealed. The time for waiting was over. The time for dying had begun. History turns on the smallest of hinges. A locked gate at Waterloo, a delayed message at Gettysburg, and here, on the Crimean steppe, a vague gesture of a gloved hand. When Captain Nolan reined in his panting charger before Lord Lucan, he brought with him not clarity, but a fog of war so dense it would suffocate the Light Brigade. The meeting between these two men was a collision of worlds. On one side sat Lord Lucan, 54 years old, a peer of the realm, a man who believed in the rigid hierarchy of the army as he believed in the gospel. To him, an aide-de-camp was a servant, a vessel for delivering messages, not a man entitled to an opinion. On the other side sat Captain Nolan, 36, the son of a consular official, a man who had risen by merit and obsession. To Nolan, Lucan was a relic, a dinosaur of patronage who was losing the war through caution. The air between them crackled with a mutual visceral loathing. Nolan handed over the scrap of paper. Lucan read it slowly, his brow furrowing. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Lucan looked up, bewildered. From his position on the low ground of the valley floor, he was blind to what Raglan could see from the heights. The Caucasus Heights, where the Russians were towing away, the Turkish guns were obscured by the rising terrain. When Lucan looked to the front, he saw only one thing, the North Valley. And at the end of that valley, a mile and a quarter away, sat the main Russian army, a solid wall of cavalry backed by a battery of Don Cossack artillery. "Attack, sir?" Lucan asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Attack what? What guns, sir?" It was a reasonable question. A general is entitled to know his objective. But Nolan, flushed with the adrenaline of his ride and the arrogant certainty of his own expertise, lost his temper. He judged Lucan's hesitation as cowardice. "There, my lord," Nolan shouted in a tone so insolent it made the staff officers nearby stiffen. He threw his arm out in a wide, sweeping gesture. "There is your enemy, there are your guns, and here lies the tragedy." Nolan's arm, arguably, pointed vaguely toward the captured redoubts on the heights to the right. But to Lord Lucan, staring down the barrel of the North Valley, that arm seemed to point directly, unmistakably, at the Russian army massed at the end of the gorge. The die was cast. Lucan, stung by the public insinuation of cowardice, shut down his critical faculties. If the commander-in-chief wanted him to attack the Russian army with a single brigade of light cavalry, then he would do it. He would obey the order, even if it was madness. It was the malicious compliance of a bureaucrat sending men to their deaths to prove a point. Lucan rode over to Lord Cardigan. The conversation that followed was the final safety mechanism failing. Cardigan, for all his foolishness, was a cavalryman. He took one look down the valley and saw the trap immediately. "Certainly, my lord," Cardigan said, dropping his sword in a salute that dripped with irony. "But allow me to point out that the Russians have a battery in the valley in our front, and batteries and riflemen on each flank." "I know it," Lucan replied, his voice heavy with the resignation of a man binding himself to a contract he knows is fatal. "But Lord Raglan will have it so. Lord Raglan will have it so." With those 6 words, the debate ended. Cardigan turned his horse. He did not argue further. He did not send a messenger back to clarify. He was a Brudenell. He had been given an order, and he would execute it with a disdainful courage that bordered on the suicidal. He rode to the front of the Light Brigade and uttered the command that would echo through history. "The brigade will advance." The 17th Lancers were positioned in the first line on the left flank. To their right rode the 13th Light Dragoons. Behind them rode the 11th Hussars, Cardigan's own regiment, and the 4th Light Dragoons and the 8th Hussars. Captain William Morris, commanding the 17th, sat before his men. He was a veteran of Indian wars. He knew the smell of slaughter. He looked down the valley, that long, flat corridor of green turf flanked by dark hills, and he knew. He turned to his officers, his face pale but composed. "My God," he whispered, "what is to become of us?" But there was no time for philosophy. The trumpets sounded the walk. The 17th Lancers moved off. It was a movement of breathtaking precision. Despite the uneven ground, despite the terrifying prospect before them, the line was as straight as a ruler. The men sat deep in their saddles, their lances held upright, the pennants red and white fluttering in the breeze. The only sounds were the champing of bits, the creak of leather, and the dull thud of hooves on the damp earth. Cardigan, riding 2 lengths ahead of his staff, set the pace. He rode a chestnut thoroughbred with 2 white stockings. He did not look back at his men. He rode stiff-backed, staring straight ahead at the Russian guns, consumed by a grim determination to show his brother-in-law and the world how a gentleman dies. The pace increased to a trot, march. The jingling of the chains grew louder. The rhythm of the advance began to hypnotize the men, locking them into the collective will of the regiment. And then a sudden disruption. From the flank, a rider broke cover and galloped frantically across the front of the advancing brigade. It was Captain Nolan. He was waving his sword, shouting, his mouth open in a desperate cry. He rode diagonally across the path of Cardigan and the 17th Lancers, pointing frantically, wildly toward the right, toward the causeway heights, toward the correct objective. It seemed certain, in the cold light of retrospective analysis, that Nolan had realized the horror of his mistake. He saw the brigade heading into the valley of death instead of turning toward the redoubts, and he was trying in those final fleeting seconds to turn the tide, to redirect the charge. Cardigan, seeing this insolent officer crossing his front a breach of military etiquette so severe it enraged him more than the Russian cannon stood in his stirrups to shout him down. But Nolan never spoke. A Russian shell, fired from the Fidyukhin hills, exploded in the air. A fragment of iron, jagged and hot, struck Captain Nolan in the chest. It tore through his heart. What happened next haunted every man who witnessed it. Nolan did not fall immediately. His body, dead in the saddle, but held upright by the rigidity of rigor and the tight grip of his knees, remained on the horse. His sword arm stayed raised, and from his dead throat came a sound that rose above the thunder of the hooves, a long, unearthly, agonized shriek. His horse, terrified by the scream of its dead master, wheeled around and galloped back through the advancing lines of the 13th Light Dragoons and the 17th Lancers. The troopers opened their ranks to let the ghastly apparition pass. They watched as the body of the man who had ordered their death rode past them, a harbinger of the fate that awaited them all. Cardigan, unaware that Nolan was dead, merely grunted in annoyance at the breach of discipline and turned his eyes back to the Russian guns. "Steady, steady, the 17th, the officers cried. "Close in! Keep your dressing!" The death of Nolan removed the last hope of salvation. The only man who could have corrected the error was gone. The brigade was now committed. They had passed the point of no return. The silence of the valley began to tear apart. The Russian gunners at the far end, having recovered from their initial shock at the audacity of the British, began to find their range. The first round shots, solid iron balls weighing nearly 20 pounds, began to plow through the turf. To the men of the 17th Lancers, the experience was surreal. They could see the white puffs of smoke from the Russian batteries a mile away. They could count the seconds 1, 2, 3 before the sound of the discharge reached them, a deep, booming crump, and then the terrifying whoosh of the ball passing through the air. When a round shot hits a file of cavalry, it does not stop at the first man. It acts like a bowling ball striking pins. It shears through horse and man alike, taking off legs, heads, and tearing open torsos before continuing its path to kill the man behind. A trooper in the front rank of the 17th vanished in a spray of red mist. The man next to him didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, guiding his horse with his knees, pressing his boot against the boot of his neighbor to fill the gap. "Close up!" came the roar of the sergeant major. "Close up the 17th!" This is the impossible nature of the charge. It was not a wild, screaming rush. It was a disciplined advance into a meat grinder. The men were ordered to regulate their pace to that of the slowest horse. They were dying not in a frenzy of bloodlust, but in a display of parade ground perfection. As they moved deeper into the valley, the fire intensified. Now, the batteries on the flanks opened up, from the causeway heights on their right and the Fidiocchine hills on their left. Shells and musket balls began to rain down. They were moving into the crossfire. Captain Morris, riding out in front of the regiment, felt the wind of a shell pass his cheek. He glanced back at his death or glory boys. The beautiful straight line was beginning to undulate as horses were struck. Men were silently dropping from their saddles. Riderless horses, eyes wide with terror, were trying to stay in formation, pressing in on the living, maintaining the drill they had learned in the riding schools of England. The walk was over. The trot was becoming difficult to maintain. The instinct to survive screamed at them to turn back, or to gallop madly forward to end the suspense. But the order held, steady. They were 600 yards from the guns. The faces of the Russian gunners were now visible pale blurs behind the iron wheels. The 17th Lancers lowered their lances. The tips glittered. The time for parading was done. The time for killing was at hand. Little did they know that the worst was not the fire they faced, but the fire they were about to ride into. The furnace was opening its doors. If the history of warfare were a theater, the North Valley of Balaclava would be its most claustrophobic stage. As the 17th Lancers moved deeper into the funnel, the laws of probability seemed to suspend themselves, replaced by a grim certainty of destruction. They were no longer riding through a valley. They were riding into a machine designed for the express purpose of turning cavalry into memory. We must pause to appreciate the sheer geometric cruelty of the trap. To the left of the brigade on the Fidiocchine hills stood 8 battalions of Russian infantry, 4 squadrons of cavalry, and 14 guns. To the right, on the causeway heights, were 11 battalions of infantry and 10 guns, and directly ahead, waiting like the open maw of a furnace, was the main battery, 12 heavy brass cannons, flanked by 2 more batteries, and supported by the bulk of the Russian cavalry. It was not merely a frontal assault, it was an enfilade. It was a gauntlet of fire where death arrived from 3 cardinal directions simultaneously. As the 17th Lancers passed the halfway mark, the Russian gunners on the flank switched their ammunition. They stopped firing solid round shot, which required precise aim, and began to load shell in canister. Canister is a particularly nasty invention, a tin case filled with iron balls that bursts upon leaving the muzzle, turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. When fired into a packed formation of men and horses, it does not miss. The air around the 17th Lancers began to hiss and whine. It sounded, as one survivor later recalled, like the humming of a million angry bees, but these bees stung with jagged iron. The perfectly dressed line of the Lancers began to buckle, not from fear, but from the physical impact of the barrage. A shell exploded directly above the center of the squadron, a flash of blinding light, a cloud of acrid white smoke, and when it cleared, a hole had been punched in the ranks. 4 men were down, 3 horses were thrashing on the turf, but the line did not stop. It did not even slow. The troopers on either side of the crater simply spurred their horses inward, knees locking against knees, sealing the breach as if the dead men had never existed. Close up, the shout was constant, a mantra shouted by the sergeants to combat the chaos. It was the iron rule of the British cavalry, keep the dressing. To lose formation was to become a mob, to remain a line was to remain a weapon. And so, amidst the deafening roar of the explosions, the 17th Lancers performed a miracle of discipline. They rode through the inferno as if they were on review in Hyde Park, correcting their alignment with obsessive precision, even as their comrades were torn apart beside them. The sensory experience of the charge is almost impossible for us to reconstruct in the comfort of peace. It was an assault on every faculty. The smell of sulphurous black powder was choking, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the terrified sweat of the horses. The visibility was reduced to near zero. The valley floor was shrouded in a thick hanging fog of smoke, illuminated only by the rhythmic strobe-like flashing of the Russian guns. Through this gloom, the skull and crossbones badge on the caps of the 17th seemed to float like ghostly apparitions. The death or glory boys were earning their name in the most literal sense. Every man knew that the next second could be his last. Every man flinched inwardly at the whistle of a passing shell, waiting for the impact that would end his world. Yet, outwardly, they were stone. Consider the psychological weight of this moment. In most battles, adrenaline takes over. A soldier runs, he shoots, he screams, he acts. But the 17th were not yet allowed to act. They were still at the trot. They had to sit passive in their saddles, holding their lances upright, enduring the slaughter without the release of fighting back. They were absorbing punishment without the ability to return it. It requires a specific, terrifying kind of bravery to walk into fire without raising a hand to defend oneself. The carnage among the officers was appalling. They rode in front, conspicuous in their gold lace, the preferred targets of the Russian riflemen on the hills. Lieutenant Young, riding on the flank, turned to check his men and saw a shell take the head off his sergeant. He wiped the debris from his jacket and faced front. There was no time to mourn, there was only the objective. As they closed to within 200 yards of the main battery at the end of the valley, the nature of the fire changed again. The flank batteries ceased firing, fearful of hitting their own men at the end of the cul-de-sac. Now, the 17th faced the full, undivided attention of the 12 guns directly ahead. The Russian gunners, seeing this wall of horsemen emerging from the smoke, began to load double-shotted canister. They were firing point-blank. The devastation was absolute. The front rank of the 17th Lancers was practically swept away. It was as if a giant scythe had been swung at waist height. Horses turned somersaults, pitching their riders forward into the mud. Men were thrown clear only to be trampled by the hooves of the rear rank, who would not stop. Captain Morris, seeing the battery looming large, finally let the discipline slip the leash. He turned in his saddle, his face blackened with powder, his sword raised high. Gallop, the trumpet sounded. The pent-up energy of the last mile was released in a single explosive surge. The horses, maddened by the noise and the pain, stretched their necks. The trot broke into a canter, the canter into a full gallop. The sound of the hooves changed from a rhythmic thudding to a continuous rolling thunder. The lances were lowered. The steel tips, which had been pointing at the sky, now leveled at the chests of the Russian gunners. The death or glory boys were no longer targets, they were missiles. At this speed, the landscape blurred. The Russian guns were no longer distant threats. They were monstrous physical realities, growing larger with every stride. The 17th could see the faces of the artillerymen bearded, wide-eyed, frantic, as they tried to sponge out the barrels for one last shot. It was a race between the speed of the British horse and the reload time of the Russian gun. If the Russians could fire one last volley of canister, the 17th would be wiped out to a man. If the 17th could close the distance before the match touched the vent, they would exact a terrible revenge. The last 50 yards were covered in seconds. The roar of the battlefield seemed to recede, replaced by the singular focus of the kill. The troopers picked their targets. The lances were gripped tight, tucked under the arm. The Russian battery commander shouted the order to fire. The matches descended. The 17th Lancers, screaming the incoherent cry of men who have passed through the valley of the shadow of death, braced for the impact. They were not fighting for the Queen or for the Empire or for the strategic value of the Turkish guns. They were fighting for the man on their left and the man on their right. They were fighting because there was nowhere else to go but forward. The guns erupted one last time, a sheet of flame, a storm of iron, and then, through the smoke, the survivors smashed into the battery. There is a moment in the physics of a cavalry charge, known to every student of ballistics and bone, where the irresistible force meets the immovable object. For the 17th Lancers, that moment arrived in a crash of noise that tore the sky apart. They did not merely ride up to the Russian guns, they rode over them. The final volley from the battery had done its work, ripping holes in the line, but the momentum of the survivors was now unstoppable. Horses, maddened by the spur and the terror of the gauntlet, launched themselves into the air, clearing the iron muzzles and the gabions in a single, desperate leap. It was a scene of apocalyptic fury, the cherry-bummed hussars and the skull-badged lancers descending from the smoke like avenging angels, landing in the very heart of the Russian position. The impact was visceral, a sickening crunch of horseflesh colliding with iron wheels and human bodies. The Russian gunners, brave men who had stood their ground at the last second, were now trapped in a cage of their own making. They had no time to flee. They fought with the desperation of the doomed, wielding their sponge staves and rammers as clubs, slashing out with short artillery swords. But they were infantrymen standing on the ground, and they were facing the finest swordsmen in Europe mounted on half a ton of moving muscle. For the men of the 17th, the lance, that long, elegant weapon of the pursuit, became a liability in the tight, chaotic confines of the battery. There was no room to couch it, no space to generate the speed required for a thrust. Many cast them aside, the ash shafts clattering onto the blood-soaked earth, and drew their sabers. The sound of the battle changed instantly. The booming of the cannon was replaced by the sharp, ringing clang of steel on steel, the dull thud of heavy blades biting into cloth and bone, and the screams of men dying in close quarters. It was no longer a battle of maneuver, it was a brawl. It was savage, intimate, and horrifyingly personal. A trooper would lean from his saddle, swinging his saber in a backhand arc, aiming for the flat caps of the gunners. A horse would rear, its iron-shod hooves crushing a man who had tried to hamstring it. Captain William Morris, the man who had drilled the regiment for this very moment, led the way. He drove his horse straight at the Russian officer commanding the battery. It was a duel played out in seconds. Morris parried a thrust and drove his own sword through the Russian's body with such force that the blade became wedged in the bone. For a terrifying moment, the British captain was tethered to his dying enemy, unable to free his weapon. It was a tableau that encapsulated the entire charge, the victor and the vanquished, locked together in a fatal embrace. Morris was set upon by other gunners, struck on the head, and knocked from his horse, falling into the mud amidst the wheels of the very cannon he had captured. He lay there, dazed and bleeding, listening to the battle rage above him, a cacophony of English curses and Russian prayers. But the 17th did not stop to tend to their wounded. The momentum of the charge carried them through the battery and out the other side, and it was there, in the open ground behind the guns, that they encountered the true horror of their situation. They had assumed perhaps that taking the guns would be the end of it, that the Russians would break. But as the smoke cleared, revealing the landscape beyond the battery, the survivors of the 17th Lancers reined in their heaving horses and stared in disbelief. Facing them, arranged in solid, dark squares, was the rest of the Russian cavalry, specifically the terrifying bulk of the Russian hussars and Cossacks, thousands of them. They sat motionless, a grey wall of men and horses, watching the handful of British survivors emerge from the smoke like ghosts. The numerical disparity was comical. The 17th Lancers had entered the valley with 145 men. They emerged behind the guns with perhaps 50 still in the saddle. 50 men, on blown horses with blunted swords, facing a fresh army. Logic dictated surrender, sanity demanded it, but the 17th Lancers were operating on a different fuel now. They were drunk on survival. They had ridden through the fires of hell and come out the other side. They were not about to bow down to a line of hussars who hadn't fired a shot. In what must be considered one of the most psychologically jarring moments of the war, the Russian cavalry did not immediately charge. They seemed paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the British. They had watched these madmen ride through a crossfire that should have killed a brigade, storm a battery that should have been impregnable, and now, instead of surrendering, these bloodied, ragged survivors were forming a line to attack them. It broke the Russian resolve. It was a triumph of moral force over physical reality. The Russian commander, seeing this skeleton regiment preparing to charge him, hesitated. He could not comprehend the enemy he was facing. Were they immortals? Were they demons? The 17th didn't give him time to solve the riddle. With a hoarse, ragged cheer, more of a croak from parched throats, they spurred their exhausted horses forward. Go for them! They smashed into the Russian hussars with the force of a desperate hammer. It was a collision of the exhausted against the fresh, but the 17th fought with a ferocity that terrified their opponents. They were fighting not for victory, but for existence. They hacked their way into the grey mass, the skull and crossbones badge now splattered with the blood of the enemy. For a few glorious, impossible minutes, the 17th Lancers routed a force 10 times their size. The Russian hussars, unnerved by the mad Englishmen, began to fall back. The discipline of the Russian ranks crumbled. They turned their horses. The British were actually driving them back. But the laws of war are cruel, and they are patient. As the 17th pressed their advantage, the trap began to close. The Russian infantry on the causeway heights, seeing that their own cavalry was failing to destroy the remnants of the Light Brigade, began to move. They marched down the slopes, positioning themselves across the valley floor, the very same valley the British would have to cross to get home. They were closing the door. At the same time, the Cossack regiment's irregular light cavalry, who specialized in picking off the wounded, began to swarm around the flanks of the 17th. They swarmed like wasps, darting in with their long lances to stab at the British troopers, then retreating before a saber could answer them. The realization hit the survivors of the 17th like a splash of ice water. They looked back the way they had come. The valley, their only escape route, was filling with enemy infantry. The guns they had silenced were being remanned by Russian reserves. They were a tiny island in a rising sea of grey uniforms. There were no buells left to sound the retreat. The trumpeters were dead or unhorsed. There were no officers left to give the order. Morris was down, the others scattered or killed. It was a collective, silent understanding that passed through the regiment. The job was done. The guns were silenced. The honor of the army had been satisfied to a degree of madness. Now the only objective was to save what could be saved. They turned their horses' heads toward the British lines. Toward home. But home was a mile and a quarter away. back through the same valley, back through the same crossfire. And this time they would be riding it alone, without the unity of the formation, without the fresh legs of their chargers. The Russian gunners in the flank batteries, seeing the British turn to retreat, ran back to their pieces. They reloaded. They adjusted their elevation. They waited. The men of the 17th Lancers, those few who remained, gathered together in small knots. They were bleeding, their uniforms tattered, their swords notched. They looked at each other, the groom from Yorkshire, the farmhand from Devon, the aristocrat from London, and they nodded. They had ridden into the valley of death together. Now they would have to ride out of it. But as they spurred their horses for the gauntlet of the return, they saw a sight that chilled the blood. Across the valley floor, blocking their path, stood a solid line of Russian lancers. They were cut off. The trap was shut. It was here, in the shadow of the Russian guns, that the true test of the death or glory motto would be made. They had found the glory. Now they faced the death. To turn one's back on an enemy is a difficult thing for a soldier. To do so when that enemy is blocking the only road home is a nightmare. The survivors of the 17th Lancers, their horses blowing hard, their sabers dripping, found themselves staring at a solid wall of Russian lancers drawn up across the valley floor. The door had been slammed shut. They were trapped in the abattoir. It was here that the sheer primal instinct of self-preservation took over. There were no orders given, no intricate maneuvers attempted. The remnants of the 17th, mixed now with the survivors of the 13th Light Dragoons and the 8th Hussars, formed a desperate, ragged wedge. They did not charge so much as they collided. They threw themselves at the Russian line with the hysterical strength of men who have looked into the abyss and decided they are not ready to fall. The Russians, perhaps unnerved by the sight of these bloodied specters emerging from the smoke, or perhaps simply reluctant to die for a battle that was already won, wavered. The British troopers hacked their way through. It was a chaotic, scrambling melee, pistols fired at point-blank range, lances parried with broken swords. And then, suddenly, they were through. They were out of the trap, but they were not safe. They still had a mile of open ground to cover. The guns on the causeway heights to their left as they retreated were still active, manned by fresh Russian crews who began to pour fire into the retreating backs of the heroes. It was at this moment that a debt of honor was paid, one often forgotten in the British retelling of this day. High on the Fiducian hills to the right, the French General Bosquet had watched the slaughter with horror. "It is magnificent," he famously remarked, "but it is not war." Yet he did not merely watch, he acted. He ordered his own elite cavalry, the Chasseurs d'Afrique, to charge the Russian batteries on the hills. These French horsemen, mounted on swift Arab chargers, swept across the broken ground and silenced the Russian guns that would have finished off the Light Brigade. It was a gallant, brotherly act of salvation. Without the French, it is likely that not a single man of the 17th Lancers would have returned to the British lines. Down in the valley, the retreat became a solitary, agonizing ordeal for every man. The formation was gone. It was now a procession of the maimed. Men rode with shattered arms dangling by their sides. Others clung to the necks of their horses, blood soaking their tunics. The ground they rode over was a carpet of debris shakos, broken lances, dead horses, and the bodies of the friends they had joked with at breakfast. To ride back through one's own dead is a psychological burden heavier than any pack. Slowly, in ones and twos, they began to emerge from the smoke at the western end of the valley. The spectators on the heights, who had watched the charge begin 20 minutes earlier in glorious order, now stared in silence. They saw single horses limping in, some carrying men, some with empty saddles. They saw officers walking, using their swords as canes. Lord Cardigan had already returned. He had ridden back alone, apparently unhurt, though he had faced the fire as bravely as any man. He rode up to General Scarlett of the Heavy Brigade. He was not weeping, he was not shaking, he was furious. "It is a mad-brained trick," he muttered, "but it is no fault of mine." Even in the face of annihilation, his first thought was to absolve himself of blame. But the men of the 17th had no time for the politics of their general. They dismounted, their knees trembling as they hit the ground. They loosened the girths of their surviving horses, patting the necks of the beasts that had carried them through fire. And then the reality set in. The regimental sergeant major, a man of iron discipline who had kept the line straight in the face of canister, took out his roll book. He stood before the gathering of survivors. The wind whipped across the plain, cold and biting. "Troop 1, he called. A handful of voices answered. "Here, Sergeant. Here. Troop 2. Silence. A long, stretching silence. A name was called. No answer. Another name. No answer. Another name. The gaps in the ranks were not merely empty spaces. They were chasms. Of the 145 men of the 17th Lancers who had ridden out that morning, only 38 answered their names at the first muster. Over 3/4 of the regiment was gone dead, wounded, or captured. The officers looked at each other with hollow eyes. Captain Morris, who had led them with such fire, was missing. He would be found later grievously wounded, having dragged himself up the hill. The young lieutenants, the boys who had bought their commissions for sport, were lying broken in the mud of the North Valley. It was a scene of profound desolation. There was no cheering. There was no sense of victory. There was only the stunned, ringing silence of men who cannot believe they are still breathing. The 17th Lancers had done everything that was asked of them. They had obeyed the order. They had taken the guns. They had preserved the honor of the badge. But as they looked back down the darkening valley, where the carrion birds were already beginning to circle, the cost of that honor became unbearable. They were the death or glory boys, and they had found both in equal measure. But as night fell on the Crimea, it was the death that seemed to weigh heaviest on their souls. The smoke clears, but the memory remains. As the broken remnants of the Light Brigade huddled around their campfires that night, shivering in the Crimean chill, a French general named Pierre Bosquet offered the verdict that would become the epitaph of the entire campaign. Watching the retreat, he shook his head and murmured, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre. C'est de la folie. It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness." In that single sentence, he captured the terrible paradox of Balaclava. It was a moment of sublime military incompetence, redeemed only by a display of courage so pure it bordered on the spiritual. The charge of the Light Brigade was a tactical disaster. It achieved nothing of strategic value. The Russian army remained in place, the guns remained captured, and the British cavalry was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. But when the news reached London, carried by the telegraph and the searing dispatches of William Howard Russell in the Times, the British public did not see a defeat. They saw a martyrdom. They read of the 17th Lancers riding into the cannon's mouth, not because they thought they could win, but because they had been told to go. In an age of industrial change and uncertainty, this adherence to the old feudal code of duty struck a deep, resonant chord. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate, read the reports and, in a few minutes of inspired grief, penned the lines that would grant the 17th Lancers immortality. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. The poem transformed a military blunder into a sacred myth. It ensured that while the names of the generals Raglan, Lucan, Cardigan would forever be associated with stupidity, the men of the regiment would be elevated to the pantheon of heroes. Yet, beyond the poetry, the charge marked a turning point in the history of warfare. It was the last gasp of the chivalric era. The sight of lancers charging artillery was a collision between the medieval and the modern. The industrial age, with its rifled barrels and explosive shells, had announced its arrival. The day of the shock cavalry charge was over. The machine had conquered the horse. Today, the 17th Lancers live on, amalgamated through the currents of history into the Royal Lancers, Queen Elizabeth's own. The skull and crossbones badge is still worn, a silver spectre on the beret. But it is more than just a piece of metal. It is a contract. Every young trooper who dons that cap badge today walks in the shadow of the 600. They inherit a legacy that is heavy with the weight of those who fell in the North Valley. As we look back across the span of 170 years, the controversy of the order fades. The arguments between Lucan and Nolan, the vagueness of Raglan's pencil, these are matters for historians to debate in warm libraries. But for us, standing in spirit on the edge of that valley, what remains is the silence. It is the silence of the aftermath, the silence of men who looked death in the face and did not blink. The 17th Lancers proved that while generals may err and governments may fail, the spirit of the British soldier remains a constant, shining light in the fog of war. They rode for a badge, they rode for each other, they rode for a glory that time cannot dim, and in the end they found it. The guns are rusted now, the valley is quiet. But listen closely to the wind on the Crimean steppe, and you may still hear it, the jingle of the bit chains, the thunder of the hooves, and the defiant cry of the death or glory boys, charging forever into history.